Right, so the ants. It's difficult with these things to just to know how much the people attending know, and I'm pretty sure, well, I know for certain that there are people here this evening who know a lot more about the taxonomy of ants than I do. And hopefully there are people that know quite a bit less and will learn more, but hopefully there'll be something in this for everyone. Let's see. So the ants, as many of you may know, are all contained in one family, the Formicidae of the order Hymenoptera, along with the bees and the wasps, which are a more diverse group in more different families. The current estimate is that there are around about 14,000 species of ants in the world that have been named. Estimates vary a lot as to what the final total might be, but somewhere around about 20,000 seems to be the consensus on the basis of new finds over the years. In the UK, for the book that Andy Jarman, who I know is here this evening, welcome Andy, and I are writing, Andy doing all the keys and me doing all the sort of text and most of the photographs. For that, at the moment, it's to be published next year, delayed by COVID, but at the moment we've settled on 61 species, half a dozen of which only occur in the Channel Islands. So we're talking about 54 species on the UK and Irish mainland. The distribution of them is very much southerly. I can't just remember the exact figures, but in a recent review of, or a second edition of an atlas of the ants of Kent by my previous co-author Jeff Allen, they list over 40 species, whereas the most recent account I've got of, for example, Yorkshire ants, where I lived until a year ago, by Cedric Collingwood, was 17. And that's fairly indicative of the situation within the British Isles, that there are many more species in the south. I've tried to sort of focus this more on what I've just, for the sake of argument, called the Northwest ant. So there's far more to tell you about ants and their identification than I could cover in an hour anyway. So I focused on those that I've loosely referred to as the Northwest ants. And then if there's time, we could go on and have a look at some other interesting ones that at the moment aren't known to occur in the Northwest or even near it, but we'll see how time goes for that. So quite an impoverished fauna in relation to the rest of the world, and they are very much tropical, the ant group as a whole, but it's a reasonably nice number to get your head round. So it's got its downside in that there isn't as much variety. On the other hand, it's not an overwhelmingly large number. So just very quickly, where we are in relation to the groups within the Formicidae. So we've got all of these. I can't actually see that yet. Okay. This you'll probably may want to look at later in the recording. So I've just put here all the different groups. Those that are in red with an asterisk are subfamilies that occur in the UK, and then the numbers after, whether it's in red with an asterisk or not, represents the best guess of the Ant Wiki as to the number of species in the world. It's probably changed since yesterday. So, for example, the Formicidae, which is one of the biggest groups, and it's one of our two big subfamilies, has around about 4,000 species worldwide. The yes means that there are ones which occur in the rest of Europe that don't occur in the UK, and then the final number, 25, indicates that that's what we think, or what I think anyway, there are in the UK. So 25 species in the UK, about 4,000 just over in the world, and there are some that if you go onto the continent, you could see. Well, that's not that interesting, but it's the other ones where there are yeses that are not red that might be just a little bit interesting. So the, for example, the Leptonillinae, which I know very little, if anything, about, do occur in countries within Europe, but there are none in the UK. That's why they're not in red. I think they're mainly found in Spain, outside of other parts of the world. And the Prosoterinae occur, a few species occur in Europe. But as you'll see, most of them occur neither in Europe nor in the UK, because, as we said, they are very much tropical. Just to pick out one or two, the Dorylinae, which we don't have any of, are the army ants and driver ants. The Myrmicinae, absolutely amazing things. I saw them when I was in Australia quite a few years ago now, are the well-known bulldog ants. The Panaponerinae are interesting. There's only one species, and I've seen that in Costa Rica. It's referred to as the bullet ant. It's a good inch and a bit long, and called that because apparently if you're stung by one, it feels as if you've been shot. So not something that I would recommend. Okay, so we're going to focus obviously on the UK ants, which is just 4 subfamilies with, I think it's 17 subfamilies worldwide. So that narrows it down quite a bit for us, from possibly now 14,500 species to 50 odd. Then, of course, in the ants, as many of you will know, people know about flying ants. You often get reports. It's about the only thing, if you type ants early on into Google and you don't refine it a bit, you tend to mainly get things about flying ant swarms and pestilence of flying ants due to hit this, that, and the other parts of the country, or how to get rid of ants. Flying ants, as I'm sure many of you will know, are the sexual forms, the males and the queens or gynes, which fly at certain times of year. It varies a little bit, and I'll tell you about a resource where you can find a bit more about that later on. And they are, of course, the ones which are involved in generally reproduction of the colony. It's not so straightforward. Ants do all sorts of weird things, like colonies will split, happens a lot in the wood ants and so on. We're not going to go into any of that tonight, but I ought to just mention the queens and workers. So, whoops, that isn't what I wanted to do. So if I click on there, for example, the beast on the left with the red, hopefully you can see my cursor, with the red tip to its abdomen, that's a male Formica rufa, or southern wood ant, photographed in Blean woodlands in near Whitstable in Kent. And then these two are actually a non-mainland species. This is a winged queen, and this is a non-winged or dialate queen of Formica pratensis. These pictures were taken on Guernsey. Formica pratensis, I'll mention it possibly again later, used to occur on the UK mainland around Bournemouth, but ceased to do so in the 80s, but can still be found in Guernsey, where I've seen it, and also apparently in Jersey. I won't be saying anything more about queens or males this evening, just simply because otherwise it would just run away with all the time. But, you know, if people are interested and Tanyptera are interested, maybe we could, you know, have another session on some of these things I'm not going to get time to look at this evening. Okay, so this is some work it's a bit of a work in progress. The most obvious place where it's a work in progress is this ant down here. But these are very small, low-res versions of some very highly detailed pictures that between Andy Jarman and I, with the kind help of Liverpool Museum and Manchester Museum in my case, and Edinburgh, I'm not sure which establishment in Edinburgh Andy used, but loans of specimens and superb focus stacking equipment in those establishments. I've put together a picture of a worker, hopefully of every one of our 61 species, including the Channel Islands ones. These will be going not actually that much bigger than this because of the limitations of space in the new book, which will hopefully be coming out next year. But that, we're not going to go through all that, but that just shows you 2 or 3 things. First of all, those are our ants. 11 species of Formica, 14 of Lasius, 12 of Myrmica, and then 24 of various other bits and pieces, which I'll come back to variously later if there's time. It also shows you that there isn't that much variety in the ants. They all look a bit similar. What you don't have on there really is any idea of size. So this fella down here, for instance, if I can find it, this one here, Formicoxenus nitidulus, is sometimes referred to. Some ants have common names. This is sometimes referred to as the shining guest ant, or SGA. It's a tiny wee thing, lives with wood ants, and we don't know much about it as far as I'm aware, and including not that much information about where it occurs. It's one that might be worth looking for to have a quick way of advancing our knowledge of where things are. It does occur throughout the country. It's often seen in the cairngorms, and my first good view of it was in the Derby Dales, and then I captured a few specimens down in Kent a few weeks ago. So there isn't an idea of scale but on here, but if you look at them, they're quite similar. There are a few that stand out quite strikingly. This one, as I say, because it's tiny and very shiny. In the Lasius, they're all either basically yellow or blackish, darkish coloured, except this one here, Lasius fuliginosus, the shining jet black ant, as it's sometimes called, and that's unmistakable because it's very, very shiny and has a head unlike any of the other ants, bar Formica execta, with this big notch at the back. More about that later. So that's just a quick sort of overview of what we've got, and obviously we won't be looking at all of them this evening. Okay, so the first thing I thought we'd just talk about is finding, collecting, and preserving ants. There's probably more in this than that, but that's the title I've chosen. So just to quickly go through, again, there'll be familiarity, I know, with some of this in some of the people here. So a very simple pitfall trap system. This is just a yogurt pot. It's actually a Dungeness when I was trying to find Ponerine ants there. And in this case, I've just left it empty. So it's just a dry pitfall trap. I was able to do that. I thought that might be the best thing to do because I wanted some, if possible, live specimens. I have to add, I didn't find any, in order to get some animated pictures of ants, which is what we're going to include in the book. But you can put into it a little bit of water and a drop of detergent. That will effectively stop anything that falls in, which won't just be ants, from getting out again, but of course it will kill them. It won't preserve them, so you need to put some sort of preservative, and it's difficult to know what to recommend with rules and regulations. It always used to be ethanol, but there are various other things, and they are mentioned in the book. So that's one way. Another way of finding ants is to look underneath stuff. These are some tiles that I can't work out, we can't work out, nobody there knows, as far as I can gather, who put them out, but these are tiles, somebody that's here tonight might know. These are roof tiles that were put out at Dungeness some years ago, I don't know how many, there's quite a lot of them, dozens, and I think in one case where I looked at 20 on a particular plot, 11 of them had nests of this ant that you can see mainly larvae of here, which is Tetramorium caespitum. So looking underneath logs, stones, roof tiles, and in crevices and so on is another good way of finding nests. This is the kind of thing you see when you turn one over. This is Lasius, probably flavus, I think. You can see the galleries, because obviously the roof of the galleries that you can see here, the roof would be formed by the stone or the tile or whatever it was that was over here. So looking underneath things in crevices, later on, if there's time, because it's not a northwest species, but there's one that commonly nests in things like snail shells, or I've found it most commonly when I've done the bit of searching I've done, because I live in the north, so I can only search for these southern species when I'm down there. I found it living in hollow stems, particularly Viper's bugloss, which is a little species of Temnothorax called Temnothorax albipennis. So looking inside things, possibly nests, will be found. The Temnothorax, by the way, is sometimes I think called an acorn ant because it sometimes nests in hollow acorns. Another thing you can do is put out bait. This particular example I've chosen here is putting out a bit of orange. And again, this isn't a species you're likely to find in the northwest. Myrmicina graminicola, I think it's sometimes called the grass ant, has been attracted to it. Mike Fox, who I know is here this evening, told me about putting out Cape crumbs, for example, to find Myrmica schenki down in a park in London. We didn't find them on the occasion that we went, but there's some nice photographs on the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society's website, which is sadly down at the moment, but I'm sure they'll get it going again soon. There's some nice photographs on there of it being attracted to, I think in that case, pink breadcrumbs. So once you've got some ants, you'll want to collect them. And there are various ways of doing that, and I won't dwell long on it, but here's a sweep net. So that might be another way of actually finding them, is sweeping through vegetation. They'll often be on vegetation, doing things like tending or milking aphids for their honeydew. So you can often get them in sweep netting samples, or in, as we've got in the middle here, beating tray samples. And then when you've got them, one way of getting them out is to just pick them up, which is what I often do. Some of the British ants have a bit of a sting. One or two of the Myrmica, and I can't just off the top of my head remember which ones are the worst. One or two of the Myrmica, it's a little bit painful, but in the main, there's nothing to fear from the British ants in that respect. Those that don't, they're the myrmicines that sting, some of them, and the Ponera. Those that don't sting, the formicines do, particularly the wood ants, squirt formic acid, which can be a little bit disturbing. When I've been digging up nests years ago when I was doing research, you feel a little bit overcome sometimes by the quantity of formic acid. Something like 45% of the wet weight of a worker can be formic acid, which is closely related to vinegar. It's HCOH rather than CH3COH, and it's the stuff I think you get to descale kettles with. You need to be a bit careful there with a pooter or aspirator, because if you suck in a formicine and it starts squirting formic acid, you can end up, sucking that into your nasal passage. It can be a little bit unpleasant. So there's the health and safety bit. Just picking them up is quite often effective. Just to show you an example, because it's the only example of this I've got to show you other than a dried specimen. This is the shining guest ant, which I managed to collect from a nest down in Kent a couple of weeks ago. And there's just a little bit of film. You can see how shiny that is. And in a picture later, if we get there, you'll see how much smaller it is than a wood ant. So that was collected just by picking it up with a load of bits of nest material and popping it into a specimen tube. Another very effective way of, another very effective way of collecting ants is to do some sieving. This was actually on Guernsey, where I was taken around by the very helpful and knowledgeable Andy Marquis, who spends a lot of his time at the weekends sieving stuff. We were actually here by a sort of municipal place where they get rid of rubbish, and just looking at material on the roadside, basically. But we were there because in his sieving operations, Andy had come across this, which is here. You can see the size of it. That's Andy's index finger. This is a thing called Strumigenus perplexa. There you can see it if you weren't spotting it. There's an arrow there. So that was in that tray. And that's just an enlarged picture of it. Absolutely amazing thing. It's got this very strange head, which I guess is because it has these sort of almost, I can't think of the word now, sort of snapping jaws. It seems to feed on colembala or springtails. And there is a lovely picture, which Andy's given me permission to use in the book, but I don't think I've included it tonight, of one of these with a springtail in its jaws. So what I think is going on here is that it's got big muscles, which are so big, its head has to be extended at the back to accommodate them, to give these, for its size, very powerful jaws. This now is living in the wild on Guernsey, has been added to the list on the Bee Wars website, and Andy seems to think it's there because down the road there is a building that was once a garden centre, and it might well be that this thing has been brought in on exotic plants and has found the climate of Guernsey suitable for it to breed and reproduce outside. But he's finding it a lot there now. He says, tell people to look for it in the south of England, and you never know, they might find it. And there's all sorts of other stuff too. But that's really there, not to talk too much about that, but to show that, you know, sieving can be very effective. Sieving with a lot of patience and an observant eye can yield some very interesting finds. Just an ordinary garden sieve. Okay, the other thing that you can look for, obviously, with ants, I've said a little bit about this already, but where there are actual structures is for the nests. So on here we've got the 8 kinds of nests that I've sort of identified to categorize, to do a quick key to nests, which again is going to be in the book. So we've got here the fairly unique grass vegetation mound nests of what's sometimes referred to as the yellow hill building ant, or Lasius flavus. And these, I've got pictures which show they're much more dense than this. You can get hundreds of these. This was actually down in South Wales, where I was looking for the black bog ant, but not in this particular habitat, but just dozens and dozens, and I'm sure many of you have seen these. Threatened, of course, by modern agricultural practices, because, you know, if it's ploughed and mown and so on, it's difficult for these things to form. Fascinating things. There's a lot of work being done, particularly by Tim King, showing how they affect the vegetation in the areas they live. The vegetation on the mounds is very different from that around. And then we get the ants that build a thatched nest. Rather confusingly, these consist of both wood ants and ants that are not true wood ants. I'm not going to go too much into that distinction tonight, probably. But the wood ants tend to build very large mounds. There's no scale on this, I'm sorry, but this is probably about 4 or 5 feet, 1.5 meters or so tall. This would be a Formica aquilonia, or northern wood ant nest, built of twigs and leaf petioles and so on. So you get those. There's 4 species of wood ants that do that in the UK and Channel Islands, which are Rufa, Lugubris and Aquilonia. So that's in reverse order: Aquilonia, northern wood ant; Rufa, southern wood ant; and Lugubris, which tends to sort of occur in the middle. We'll say a bit more later, the hairy wood ant. They build these big mounds, and then Formica pratensis on the Channel Islands, which also builds a biggish mound, but not as big as these. There are other species that do some thatching. Below that, there's a nest of Formica picea, the black bog ant, which I went out to see in South Wales a few months ago. There's only 2 sites really, a couple of places in South Wales and then some places in the New Forest where you have to really go out on a boat to find them, because they do live in bogs, but here it's a bit drier. Or again, as I say, you can look underneath stones, you can look in hollow stems. Here's a Temnothorax albipennis inside a Viper's bugloss stem. You get the brown tree ant, Lasius brunnius, forming galleries in trees. Lasius fuliginosus, which is one of my favourite ones, the shining jet black ant, makes these carton nests, almost like the stuff that wasps make. And then this isn't a great picture, I now realise, but this is the slave-making ant Formica sanguinea, which has a rough sort of thatch, but it always tends to be in a rotting log of some sort. And then, of course, the other thing you can do is look for ants wandering about, which in not all cases, but in some cases, they'll form very distinct trails. Here's a couple of shining jet black ants fuliginosus, and you can see now more clearly the heart-shaped head. There's one off on its way to find something, and here's one coming back with a dead aphid along a trail. The trails are sometimes so dense, and particularly if it's the wood ants, which produce formic acid and probably squirt it quite a lot, you'll see the vegetation killed. This is a trail out from a wood ant's nest. This photograph was taken about 50 years ago in the northwest of England when I was doing research up there. And here's a wood ant trail. Just happened to be quite a nice, easy one to see, because it's, as you'll see in this very short bit of video, It's just checking the time. It's going out along a fallen little tree trunk, so the ants are going all the way along there and coming back to the nest, which is around here. Okay, so you've got various ways of collecting, finding, locating ants. I've gone through. Once you've got them, you'll probably want to start thinking, you know, what is it? You'll need some sort of hand lens. The one I put pictures of here is something I got recently, which Andy Marquis showed me, which is, I think, a jeweler's hand lens. But this is quite good. They're not very expensive. You can find them on eBay and such like places. It'll do 40 times, and they do actually have a little light on. It's not a very good photograph, but it's there with the light on at the bottom. So you'll need a 20 or 40 times hand lens to really make much in the way of inroads. And if you get really into it, you will need to get some sort of stereo microscope. I'm not sure how good the digital ones are for that. I'm lucky to have one from years ago that's a not digital. And the way that you illuminate it is pretty important as well, as we'll say briefly later. So once you've got them back, you might well want to make a collection. Obviously, there are conservation issues, particularly with the rarer species. So, you know, just to mention that, it's obviously people's responsibility to make sure you don't over collect. There are three main ways. I've only illustrated two here of mounting the ants. It's become, I think, much more popular these days to do something called pointing the ants. This is down here. This is a drawing from the old edition of my and Jeff Allen's book, showing an ant stuck on a little cardboard point, and with the very important label showing date and place and name of collector. Another way of doing it is a bit more like people might do with beetles, which is to set them out on a card, as they are here. This is a drawing, I can't remember which museum it's in, but this is a drawer in one of the museum collections I've been looking at. In order to get more information on particularly pointing, there's a lovely video which I'm pretty sure is on the BWAS website. It's also on YouTube. I've put the YouTube link there, which you might be able to quickly scribble down now, but if you can't, you can look at the recording. That's been done by Matt Hamer, and it's called From Field to Point. And it would take 20 minutes of our very limited time to show you that, so I won't, but I've given you the link there to go and look at it. That's excellent, and basically shows you how to get from a dead ant killed in a way that makes it relaxed, ideally in ethyl acetate, in a killing jar, like a plaster of Paris jar with a bit of plaster of Paris in the bottom. That will kill them in a relaxed way, and then you can mount them in whatever way you want. The third way, only tend to use with larger ones, possibly sexuals, males and females, and males and queens, is to put a very fine pin through the thorax, as again you've probably seen in many beetles. I'm not going to say much about culturing ants or keeping ants as pets. Just to show you, this is a Tapinoma erraticum, again a southern species, southern in the UK colony, in one of the many sorts of Formicaria that are now available for purchase online. So if you're interested in that, again, I could do something later about it, although it's not something I've done a lot of. There are lots of books, lots of companies that will sell both Formicaria like this, with what they call outworlds and nests, and also the ants. So it's a field that could be really interesting for people, but it's not something I'm going to dwell on tonight, just really to mention it. Identifying ants, well, there's this new book that I've been working on for about a couple of years now, and Andy came in on, many thanks to him for doing that earlier this year. It's being delayed mainly because of COVID, but we do hope it's pretty much finished in first draft now. We do hope it'll be out next year. That will replace, now this is where I do need to just see if I can see myself, so that I can see I'm showing you the right thing. So that will replace this book, which was published in the mid-90s by myself and Jeff Allen, who isn't involved this time. So that's got keys in it, but they're out of date. Excellent keys by Jeff Allen to workers, males and queens. But as I say, they are out of date. There's species that are not in there. There's name changes. For example, in here, all the Temnothorax are in the genus Leptothorax, etc. So that will be superseded, hopefully within the next 12 months, by Skinner and Jarman in the same Naturalist Handbook series. I'm not sure whether it will still be number 24, but it'll be there. Okay, there's then a book that's come out recently, excellent read, and I'm just going to have to leave my desk briefly just to find it, because I've forgotten to have it in front of me and I can't quickly see it, so I won't show you it, but I'm sure you can find it online. That's Richard Jones's new book published by Bloomsbury. There is a nice straightforward key in there just to workers, not males and queens, and it's an excellent read about ants. This book, Lebas et al. Is a nice photograph book, which came out about 3 or 4 years ago. Ants of Britain and Europe, a photographic guide. Many more than just the British species in there, but it does cover all the British ones. The absolute sort of zenith of British and European ants is Bernard Seifert's The Ants of Central and North Europe, which is pretty expensive buy, but absolutely totally comprehensive with detailed keys and detailed accounts of every European species, obviously including all the British ones. And then in addition to that, there's the now very much out of date Bolton and Collingwood key in the Royal Entomological Society's series, but that's been long out of date, but still worth having. Elva Robinson and Jenny Stocken produced, I think about 5 years ago, I think it's 2017, this book on the wood ants, and it includes keys to both the European and the North American wood ants. So if you're particularly interested in wood ants, there's that one. And then, surprisingly, this one by a variety of Polish guys whose names I won't even attempt to pronounce. There's a 2002 edition, which you can get online. I think that one's lacking keys to male Lasius, if I remember rightly, but there's a new edition of The Ants of Poland, which is a very nice book and does cover all the British species. Where the ants are, obviously for the Tanyptera focus, the northwest sort of focus, which I said I would try and direct things towards, the recently published Hargreaves and White ants of beeswax and ants of Lancashire, and I think when you get inside it, it's Lancashire and North Merseyside. So that's got all the ones that have been found in those two parts. There is also, I found online by Clean Parker, a checklist, which is quite nice, of the ants of Cheshire. So that covers, I think, all those areas that we were just shown by Leanna in the film that Tanyptera is kind of mainly focused on. So that's available online. I don't think it's available in print. Going a little bit further afield from Lancashire and Merseyside and Cheshire, the South Lake District was covered a long time ago by Collingwood and Satchell in that paper there, Ants of South Lake District. And there's a paper a little bit more recent by Collingwood and Hughes of the ants in Yorkshire. I find when I go to Wildlife Trust websites and ask for ants, some have lots of stuff, others just give you 6 pictures, which include the narrow-headed ant, Formica execta, which only occurs in one place in Devon. So they're not always that useful. Now, there may be other guides I don't know about. And later on, if anyone that's here has any more information, and I'm sure others would be more than happy to hear about that. There is a rather nice checklist of ants of, I think it's Rutland and whatever the county next to Rutland is, Leicestershire or Lincolnshire, I can't remember, which I didn't include because it's a bit away from the northwest. Okay, I think I spent half an hour doing an introduction. So let's get into a bit of finding out what ant you've got. So Andy kindly agreed that I could use some of the pictures that he's prepared for the new book. So here's just one I just pulled out just to show these pesky names that things have, but it's really fairly important to get to know these. I won't go through them all now, but this, for example, shows you the main things. Obviously, there's a head, that's easy, but you'll see things in keys about hairs on the mesonotum or hairs on the tibiae, or what's the metapleural gland, or what's the propodial spiracle like, or how many scales are there in the petiole, or what's the shape of the gaster, and so on. So it's important to get to know those terms. And then these features in the middle here, in the middle part, the mesosoma, are quite important to get to know again, because they're used a lot in keys. There is a quick key, which I'll show you later on, which again mirrors the one in the old edition of our book, and will be updated for the new book. So more about that later. So the 4 British subfamilies, as I think you'll have gathered, the Ponerinae and the Dolichoderinae are poorly represented and pretty much southern in distribution. So we'll say very little more about them. The Ponerines are the most primitive of the 4 subfamilies we've got, and they are characterized by kind of looking primitive. They look a bit more like wasps than the other ants. They've got this constriction in the gaster, which you can see here. They have a sting, but then of course the Myrmicines have that, so that's not diagnostic. But you won't see those in the northwest. There was one species until I think late 80s, when Collingwood separated that into 2 species, and you can see both if you're lucky at Dungeness and a few other places in the south. The Dolichoderines, contrasting with the much more common and abundant in this country Formicines, have basically a hole at the back of the gaster, which is not fringed with hairs. So here's the hair fringed structure in the Formicinae, not in the Dolichoderines. But again, we're going to leave them because they are very much southern. We can always come back to them in questions or in a later webinar if they want one. So the 2 big subfamilies in this country are the Formicinae and the Myrmicinae, and they're pretty easily told apart in that the Formicines have a single scale in the waist. The Myrmicines have 2 parts to the waist. It's not really a scale in the Myrmicines. It's more of a blob than a scale. But there's one thing in the Formicines, 2 things in the Myrmicines. So that's a nice, easy way to know: have I got a Formicine? Have I got a Myrmicine? Okay, very quickly, the Ponerines, just to show you some pictures. So these are the 2 species we now know we have. And again, these are Andy's lovely pictures he's allowed me to use. And you can see there are other features, but they do have a different colour, not usually very useful colour in ants, but here it can be useful in separating those 2. The Dolichoderines, Tapinoma erraticum, again, very much southern, and Tapinoma suboreae. And just worth mentioning, the Argentine ant is a Dolichoderine, and you do get those in sort of buildings and glass houses and so on. Okay, the northwest ants, I've narrowed down to this. So the Formicinae, which ones do we get in the northwest, and how are you going to separate them? I've added the shining guest ant in here because although it's not a Formicine, it does live with them. So more of that later. So the 2 big black ones you'll find around the place, very often under stones and so on, and you might get them if you're sweeping. You see them a lot bigger than the black garden ant. These are somewhere in the region of 6, 7, 8 millimeters long. You can see the distribution, and thanks to BWAS for their kind permission to use the maps, both in this talk and in our book. So these are pretty up-to-date maps from BWAS, who seem to collate everything now for the ants, bees and wasps. And you can see that Fusca is much more southern in distribution, although you do get it in Scotland. And Limani is much more northern distribution, although you do get it in southern England. And also there's an altitude thing. You tend to get Limani in higher sites in the south and Fusca in lower places. So this is a more warmth-loving southerly, not so warmth-loving northerly. Not easy to tell apart. Here's an extract from the key. Again, many thanks to Andy. And the main feature is to do with the erect hairs on the pronotum here, and also hairs on the femora. I've not illustrated that. So Fusca is pretty much hairless, maybe 1 or 2 erect hairs. Limani, much hairier. Now I've just have to pick out the best pictures I've got. They're not particularly brilliant, but there's Fusca on the left. So it's got some adpressed hairiness there, but no erect hairs. I haven't got a side-on picture that I can show you, but no erect hairs there. Whereas if we look at Lemani, I've seen hairier ones than this, but there's at least half a dozen erect hairs on the thorax there. You're always best with ants, and it's generally the case that you can do it, to look at a range of material, because you hopefully find a nest or a trail, and you can look at 3 or 4 or half a dozen and get a clear picture. I mean, one of the problems here is that these hairs can get worn off as the animal ages, and so you need to look at generally more than one, but of course you may not be able to. So that's how to separate those two. You can't say, well, if you're in Scotland, it won't be Fusca, as you can see on the map here, or vice versa. And of course, you should never assume really that if you find something and it's never been found there before, it can't possibly be that. It's unlikely to be, but hope springs eternal. So sort of, you shouldn't really do it geographically, but obviously if you're further north, it's more likely to be Lemani and vice versa. One other I just want to mention while I'm here is Formica cunicularia. This, as you can see, is very much southern in distribution. It's like a wood ant in the sense that it's got this bicoloured body, which we'll come back to the wood ants in a minute. So sort of brownish, and then a more tan central part. But it has been found. There are sites, one on the Isle of Man, a couple in North Wales, a couple over here in Lincolnshire. So, you know, it might well be worth just keeping your eyes open for it. It does seem to quite like foraging on things like umbellifers. I'm just going to turn some heating on. Our heating's broken, so I'm having to rely on an electric fire. It seems to be on umbellifers, drinking nectar and predating things and so on. So you might want to keep an eye out for that. If you see a wood ant size that is getting on for a centimetre long worker, and it's got this bicoloured body, then if it's not a wood ant, and you're likely to be able to link it up with a thatched nest, then it might be this, although, you know, it'd be quite a find if you found Formica cunicularia in the Tanyptera region. Okay, so the true wood ants of the northwest, as you can see from the maps, are the hairy wood ant, Formica lugubris, and the southern wood ant, Formica rufa. So lugubris occurs commonly in the Cairngorms, the Highlands, and then a bit more scattered as you move further south. But still gets quite far down south. It's found in northern to central Wales. There's a few sites in Ireland. Formica rufa is much more southerly in its distribution, but does get way up north. Now, I think some of these records here are probably now defunct. Elva Robinson, in her survey of northern wood ants, which I think I mentioned somewhere, maybe on this slide, found that most of these Lake District colonies have now gone. When I was doing research on Formica rufa, which was in the Arnside area, I did go up to Dodd Wood in the Lake District and I saw them there. They're not there now. There seems to be a theory that they were possibly always be on the northern edge of their natural range and have been introduced in Victorian times as because the pupae are good food for pheasants. I don't know how much truth there is in that, but very sadly, when I went out to Leighton Moss, where I did 95% of the research I did back in the 70s, which was my PhD. So I went out to Leighton Hall, which some of you may know, in the Gate Barrows, Kringlebarrow Wood area. And the 9 nests I worked on, and then the 10 or 12 nests that my person that followed on from me, Stuart Warrington, worked on, had all gone. So exactly what's going on there, I'm not sure, but it seems that rufa is under threat in the northern part of its range. And the most northerly ones now are probably at Gate Barrows, where it forms some very strange colonies down grikes on limestone pavement. So the difference between these two, again, with thanks to Andy, we've got an extract from the key. So the upper margin of the PTO in lugubris is quite hairy, whereas in Rufer and some others, 19 takes you on some others, but they're not species in the northwest. It's pretty much hairless. So hence Lugubris hairy wood ant, and the others not hairy wood ant. So here's a close-up of the petiole in Lugubris and the petiole in Rufer, and I think fairly clearly see the difference there. Again, it's very variable. You also get quite a lot of hairs on the head of Lugubris, and you can get bristles coming out of the eyes, which in Rufer you tend not to see. But again, you need to look at a few specimens, probably adequate through a hand lens. They're quite big ants, centimetre long also. You should be able to see that. So these are both species. Lugubris probably less so than Rufer, but I think both sort of to a certain extent declining, and so they're well worth then looking for. And you know, if you find new sites, fantastic. I'm sure we'd all love to hear about. Okay, so here is some of that evidence that suggests what's going on. So this is Elva's report of 2011, a high meta survey report, in which she produced these two maps, which again, there isn't time to dwell on, but you can have a look in the recording. But basically the conclusion was they're both declining, but Rufer probably more so than Lugubris. And you can look back at least one of these papers is available online. I couldn't find the other, and I can't remember which was available and which wasn't now. This is something that's been going on for decades. This was a piece of paper that was presented to me by Cedric Collingwood when I went out with him looking for ants one day back in the 90s, and he'd made this list of sites lost in the last 25 to 40 years without drastic change in woodland management. And you see there's the Dodwood one there. That I did see them at Dodwoods. Cedric suggests you couldn't, but there's definite decline going on in them. So well worth looking for and looking after. Just to mention then the shining guest ant yet again, it's become one of my favourites. And again, you see it's got this wide-ranging distribution, and it only occurs with wood ants. All three UK mainland species, Lugubris, Aquilonia, and Rufer, it's been found with. I've seen it in Lugubris and Rufer nests. Up in the Cairngorms, I was pointed some nests where it's been seen by Ross Johnson and his son, who has become famous on the internet as Ant Boy, if you want to look him up. And they've seen it with Aquilonia. I didn't. And you can get here an idea of its tiny size in relation to a wood ant worker. They're very difficult to photograph, not that difficult to see. If you go out on ideally an autumn day, September, October, when it's sunny, like it was a couple of weeks ago, and just keep looking at a nest, very often you'll see them, but they only come out for a few seconds. I only managed to get a picture of this one because it ended up on my trousers and had nowhere to go. So I got a picture, but very difficult to photograph, but a fascinating thing. It's probably under-recorded and worth therefore looking for, if you are in the company of any of the three wood ant species. And again, I'm sure BWAS and anyone else that's interested in ants will be interested if you think you found it in new sites. So the other formicines are the Lasius, rather more difficult than the Formica. But first of all, we can pick off Lasius filiginosus, as I've mentioned already, because it's first of all, it's a lot bigger than the other Lasius. It's got this amazing shiny jet black body. It's got this very distinctive heart-shaped head, which, as far as I'm aware, is only present in one other British ant, and that's a wood ant-like Formica execta, which, looking at the time, we're probably not going to get time to talk about, which only occurs in Devon and then a few places in the Cairngorms, strangely. Commonly tends aphids, forms very obvious trails, and lives in carton nests made out of chewed up wood, not easy to find because they're buried under the ground, but quite widely distributed, apparently moves around quite a lot. It's a parasite of a parasite, and so it's got a fairly precarious life cycle, and I haven't got time to go into all the details of that on this occasion, but again, well worth looking for. And I think probably some of these sites up here are not extant anymore. I'm not an expert on this species, but I think it's most northerly is probably now down in Gate Barrows. But there might be people here this evening who in questions and answers can clarify that. It's one of my favourites. It's also, although I've never noticed this, it's supposed to give out a rather pungent and distinctive odour when you find it going along trails. So if you've got one with that general habitus, then it's Lasius fuliginosus, nothing else you can confuse it with. The next thing we can do is have a look at the colour. So if it's yellowish or yellowish brown in colour, then, and it's a small ant, it's clearly not a wood ant or wood ant relative, you might want to look at something called the propodial spiracle in order to distinguish the two if you're not sure. But basically, Formica can be distinguished from Lasius by size, although there are some wood ants that may be not much bigger than a big Lasius. But generally speaking, in that colony, you'll find bigger ones. So we've decided it's a Lasius on those grounds. If it's yellowish or yellowish brown, then it's going to be, this is in the northwest, it's going to be Lasius flavus, almost certainly, because that's very common, Lasius mixtus, Sabularium, or Umbratus, all of which are uncommon in the northwest. If it's dark in colour, with at least the gaster, which is a kind of abdomen behind the waist, dark brown to black, then it's Lasius alienus, most likely Lasius niger, or possibly Lasius platithorax, which I'll say a bit more about later because that's a recent addition. So to distinguish these from each other, we're then looking at erect hairs on the antennae, the tibiae, the sides of the head, and the mesosoma. As Andy has pointed out in the book, because his chapter's finished, it's important at this stage to appreciate the difference between pubescence and erect hairs, and Andy has produced some nice photographs to illustrate this. So in Lasius mixtus and Lasius flavus, there are no erect hairs. And this shows that, and it also shows the importance of how you illuminate it. So with this black background, you can see that where there are hairs, you can see them. If the background's not nice and dark, you can't see them anyway. And it'll make it clearer if I bring up the other pictures of Sabularium and Umbratus. So these have both got pubescence. They've both got hairs lying flat on the body, but these ones, flavus and mixtus, don't have these erect hairs, which some others do. So that's a point of separation for the northwest species between mixtus flavus and Sabularium umbratus. So if we go to Lasius flavus, you've seen that picture before, one of our most common ants, and you get it in gardens. It doesn't always build these earth mounds with vegetation on. It will very often, you'll find it under stones and so on. I've ended up with them in lawns and ended up mowing the lawn, and then I've realised there's lots of little yellow ants running all over the place. You don't see them much otherwise. They're almost exclusively subterranean, where they tend aphids on roots. They do a bit of predation, but they're mainly involved in milking aphids for honeydew on the roots of plants and spend almost their entire life underground, very often in these mounds, which can get to huge densities. Mixtus is much less common, but as you see, looks very similar. And I'll come back to how you separate the two shortly. But much less common, but is known roughly from the northwest region that we're talking about. Sabularium, again, very uncommon, as you'll see, just dotted around and getting up as far as some bits that could be vaguely regarded as northwestern. And then Umbratus, again, a bit more common, but again, not very common. So those are the four likely sort of yellow Lasius you're likely to find in the northwest. And then I've got this bar at the bottom of the screen that keeps getting in the way. Mixtus and flavus are separated by the length of hairs on the mesosoma, which are longer in flavus than they are in mixtus. And Sabularum and umbratus regarded as very hard to separate. And it's one of these where I think in Andy's key, he's put something like consult an expert if in doubt. You know, if it's really important that you know, because you're involved in some sort of survey work, and you think you've found one of these, and it's not been found there before, and you really need to know which one it is, it's probably consult an expert, go to a museum, look at specimens there, but it's about the hairiness of the tibia, which is hairier in Sabularum than it is in umbratus. Ants are not, at a certain level, that easy to identify. You can get a certain way, and with some of them, like Lasius legionnaires, get all the way, but with others, there's quite a lot of careful microscope work needed. Okay, we can whiz through those now. And then that brings us to the dark brown Lasius, which are dark brown, or if you like, black, Alienus, niger, and platithorax. Now, you're looking for the antennal scape, numerous erect hairs on the scape and the hind tibia, which is what this picture is of, then it's niger or platithorax. No such hairs in Alienus. Alienus, see, it's a much darker brown than the ones we're looking at. It does occur up into the northwest, but again, it's scattered, mainly coastal, as you can see there. Niger is probably, could well be our commonest ant, although according to the, what's it called, the National Biological Atlas, I think it's one of the Myrmicas, can't remember if it's Ruginodis or Rubra. But Niger is extremely common, black garden ant, and you find them all over the place. And that has the hairy tibia. And that's Niger, as you can see, very common around the country. These gaps are almost certainly due to the fact that there's nobody looking at the ants rather than no ants. Here's a nice one here with tending aphids, which of course most ants do a lot, but a droplet of honeydew there in its jaws. Now, the situation here is quite interesting. Platithorax and niger are separated on the grounds of the hairiness of the upper lip or clipius, and whether in profile it sticks out rather more. If it sticks out rather more and it's a lot hairier, then it's niger. These have only been recently separated, but I think the consensus emerging now that platithorax is more commonly found in damp woodland. So a lot of the records of niger that are hanging about in museums could well be platithorax, a kind of micro species, and may well be worth re-looking at, or the sites where they were found may well be worth re-looking at to see if we've really got platithorax rather than niger. But again, that's quite technical stuff, but if you get down to this level, it becomes really interesting, and it's the area where, you know, really new stuff can be found. So that's niger, that's platithorax, and Alienus, which I've shown you. Right, moving on now then to the northwest Myrmicines. So these are the ones with two parts to the waist that we talked about. There are 12 species in the UK, we think, and 6 of those I've defined as being vaguely northwestern. They've got 2 segments on the waist. The only other ants in this region with 2 segments are the shining guest ant, which we talked about, and I missed an X off there, Leptothorax acavorum, which we'll come back to hopefully briefly later. So after that, it's all about the antennal scape. So the scape is this first bit of the antenna, which tends to be a bit sort of angled, and then you get onto the rest of the antenna with short segments. So it's the first segment of the antenna. And separating these is one of the harder things to do in myrmecology in this country. And it's all about these scapes, the features of these scapes. And again, many thanks to Andy for producing these pictures and allowing me to use them. And as I've said time and time again, hopefully this will all be in the book, which will hopefully be out first half of next year. So in 3 of the Myrmicas, the northwest Myrmicas, Sulcinodis, Ruginodis, and Rubra, this segment is not angled, it's curved. 2 different sorts of ways of being curved, but curved. But in the others, it's got an angle, and on that angle, there's a flange or a tooth or some sort of ridge. So we've got the curved ones, which are Myrmica rubra and Myrmica ruginodis, as you can see in these pictures. So it's just got this gentle curve with no kind of angle and no process of any sort. But when we come to ones like Lobicornis, you can see there's this plate sticking out here. In Scabrinosis, it's angled. In Sabuleti, it's angled with a flange. And which one haven't we dealt with? Here we are. In Lobicornis, again, we've got this angled. Now, Andy will tell you, and if he wants to speak in questions and answers, I'd be more than happy for him to do so, that it's really important that you get the heads of the ants at the right angle, you get the illumination right, and they are quite difficult to separate. The two commonest ones you'll find are rubra and ruginodis. These are not great pictures. And these are, let me just take you to the actual page for each one. So there's rubra, one of our commonest ants. Again, this is probably reflects more the lack of interest in recording ants than the lack of ants. And then ruginodis, even more common, and either there's more of them or people are more interested in them up here than the rubra. The difference is that in rubra, the spines are a lot shorter. Now that doesn't come out particularly well in these two pictures I've managed to find for tonight, but in rubra, the distance between the spines is greater than the length of the spines generally, and in ruginodis, the spines are as long as the distance between them. So those two are fairly easy to separate, again, looking at a few specimens ideally. Now, if we go back to the others, so let's just take them in this order. So if we go to Lobicornis, which is one of the more obvious ones with this pointy bit sticking out at the angle here, again, you see it is found in our region, or your region. I'm in Scotland, so, but I'm talking about it as the region we're dealing with tonight. It is found there, but it's not that common. It would be worth looking for. And it's a question of looking at whether the antennae are like that or not. In Sulcinodis, again, found in the region, so again, probably underrecorded, worth looking for. Scabrinodis, much commoner, so, you know, not perhaps quite so much kudos to be attached to finding that. And then finally, Sabuleti, which is, I think, famously the one that tends to take on board large blue butterfly larvae and look after them, even though it kills them, or it eats their younger stages. That one's found here as well. And you can see actually quite nicely on that picture there, the process at the angle. But they are difficult to identify. And I think Andy's pictures here, which obviously I hadn't got time to really spend a lot of time looking at these tonight, because I just want to take you through the general introduction, but you'll have those, and then eventually they'll be in the book. There are guides, I think, as well on bee wars. I can't remember who did it, but there are some nice further different pictures on there and guidance as to what angle to get the head at and so on to identify these. But these are one of the bigger challenges. Okay, so that's the Myrmicas, briefly dealt with. The non-Myrmica myrmicines, I think I mentioned earlier that when the first edition of our book was published in the 90s, there were 5 species of Leptothorax. 4 of them are now been put into a different genus, Temnothorax, and are all pretty southern in distribution. But Leptothorax acivorum, which is illustrated here, is pretty widely distributed. It tends to nest in rotting wood and under bark and so on. It's rather smaller than the Myrmicas, has a very different kind of appearance and feel in the field. I think Andy puts it as the Myrmica looks like a robot, the Leptothorax sort of glides along. So that's a field feature which you might help you to identify it. But it's one of those where you get your eye in, it's kind of more tubular, smaller than any of the Myrmicas, widely distributed, but worth looking for. Not likely to find Stenamma, but has been found in parts of North Wales, and one site up here, I don't know how old that record is. This is quite a sluggish species. It's been recently separated. We thought they were all Stenamma westwoodii, but a recent paper by, I think it was Dubois, separates them into Stenamma westwoodii, which is now the much less common one. And I didn't have the map. I wanted to get it off BWAS, but the site, as I said earlier, the site's down. Whereas Debili, very much southeastern in its distribution, but that now appears to be the commoner one. And there's some evidence that westwoodii is fairly special to the UK. Probably unlikely to find it up here, but if you travel further south on your holidays or whatever and interested in looking, they both tend to be rather woodland species, very sluggish, not easy to find, not that uncommon. There's a picture of a live one. The only one of Temnothorax I'll mention is Temnothorax albipennis, only because it's been found in North Wales, so it's not really in our region. And you've seen this picture before. Worth looking in hollow stems, snail shells, empty acorns, that kind of thing, where these tiny wee ants, about 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters long, will have a whole colony. So worth looking out for, but probably unlikely if you stick within Lancashire, Merseyside, Cheshire that you'll find it. There are others, but well, Nylanderi has been found apparently at one site in North Wales, so keep your eye out for that. Tetramorium caespatum, very much a southern species really, and coastal. This is odd concentration of them up here in Scotland. Again, been found in North Wales, so worth a look. It's very characteristic, as you can see. Its legs have got this almost like a you know, one of those bladder rack type things, almost like a bladder on its legs, and very abundant where it's found, and a very interesting ant, if it's only because it's the host of one of our rarest species, which I'll just show you briefly in a minute. This one used to be called Anagator tratulus, now had its name changed to Tetramorium atratulum. Very rarely found, has this very characteristic abdomen with this groove down the middle. Workerless, this is a winged queen, this is a wingless queen, and is found in the nests of Tetramorium caespatum, but only way down south. So that's Tetramorium atratulum. Not much else to say about it, rarely seen. Jeff Allen, who lives in Kent, who obviously I've had a lot of chats with because he's my co-author. It does occur in Kent, but just there. And he's only seen it once, and that was clouds of sexuals coming off a Tetramorium nest. It's only ever found where Tetramorium caespatum is very common. And you know, you might see it if you go down south, but if you found it round here, then that would be a real find. We mentioned the two wood ants that we can regard as being likely to be found in the region that we're interested in tonight, Formica rufa and Formica lugubris. The third wood ant on the mainland, and these were only separated, that they were all called Formica rufa pre about 1944. And so when I was doing my research and getting into the literature, anything pre 1944, I wasn't really sure what they were talking about, whether it was rufa or one other. In 44, Ian Yarrow of the Natural History Museum reviewed the taxonomy and separated the rufa in this country into rufa, lugubris and aquilonia. I ought to just add at this point that there's increasing evidence, I think it's probably almost certain now, that the British rufa and actually what's called a stable hybrid between rufa and Formica polyctena, which is a continental species. Again, this is Elva Robinson, one of her students at York, has done a lot of work on sort of DNA work on this, and it looks as if we've got this hybrid, so it's not even Formica rufa at all. So I spent 3 years and then some years after that thinking about it on a species that we actually don't have. But we still tend to call it Formica rufa. But if you're interested in that, you can go online and have a look more about it. Aquilonia, very much northern, couple of places in Northern Ireland where it's found. it forms these enormous, bigger probably than any lugubris or roofer nests. They both form pretty big nests, particularly roofer. But I think this is one of Andy's pictures. I think it was near Loch Ness. He told me. He'll confirm that later if I'm wrong. But well, he won't confirm it if I'm wrong. He'll tell me I'm wrong. But they form these huge, very often form these huge nests. But in most ways, very like the other wood ants. So that one, you're not going to find that in the northwest, but it's on our little island group and fairly common around about the place in the Highlands. Formica execta, on the other hand, is a real conundrum. It's got this weird distribution where these are older records, I think, in pale green here. I think now it's confined to one sort of pretty much roadside verge and off into the sort of moors beyond in Devon, where there's huge conservation effort to look after it. And then it's more common, but still not out of the woods, if you'll excuse the pun, as it were. It's more common way up here in the Highlands and then nowhere else. So what on earth's behind that? It's the other one I said has this excised back to the head. So it's really not difficult to separate from the other wood ant. It's not a true wood ant. It's in a different subgenus than the true wood ants. It does build a thatched nest. Stupidly, I haven't put a picture of one. It's quite small, probably the size of a wok or something, a big wok or something like that, and referred to often as the narrow-headed ant, and a species with a lot of interest because of this strange distribution and the threat that it's under. It could become extinct in England sort of any time if we don't look after it. Formica pratensis has become extinct in England. You can see that pale green line there. When I started doing my research, and I went down to what was then the Fursbrook Research Station down in Dorset to have a chat with Michael Bryan and Andy Abbott and the late Graham Elms, the late Michael Bryan. This was still around in some sites around Bournemouth, but it's now gone. It's very like the other wood ants, but there are features which distinguish it. It's now gone from there, but is found on Jersey and Guernsey. I popped out to Guernsey for various reasons in May, and it's interesting what they're doing there. It's found on cliff top paths mainly, and here's a picture of a nest. They're not gigantic nests like the Aquilonia rufa and to a certain extent the lugubris, as you can see there, but there's a thatched nest, and they put these red flags to basically, I think, warn the people that go and keep the cliff top paths tidy to not disturb these nests. So they're really making a lot of effort. You can read a lot about it online, that they're making big efforts to look after this in their little bit of the archipelago that we live on, where Formica pratensis still lives. And then we've got, oops, I failed to put the name on it. We've then got Formica rufibarbis. Now, Formica rufibarbis is or was found at a few sites here in Surrey, and there was huge effort, including a £50,000 grant that was given to various people, including the London Zoo, where they tried to breed these things, to look after it. It became extinct in the Surrey sites, and I think it's all a bit sort of secretive, but I think it's now occurs at a site in Hampshire and maybe back in the Surrey sites. When I went to the Scilly Islands, St Martin's Island on the Scilly Islands is a site where it's known to still occur. When I went there about a year or so ago, I think the news then was that it was extinct on the mainland. Again, sadly, recently deceased myrmicologist John Pontin, of whom this is one of his books. There's a good little key in there, by the way, to the ants of Surrey. He described it. There's a lovely electron micrograph, a picture of its head there on the back. He described it as possibly the rarest animal in this country. And then I got the impression that we didn't have it anymore on the mainland, but I think it's now been found and it is back somewhere in this area. On the Scilly Isles, it occurs just on St Martin's. Ian Beavis from the museum in Maidstone helped me find it, and he takes students out, and they call this bit of the church common, I think it is, on St Martin's, they call it Angry Corner, because there are lots of these very aggressive Formica rufibarbis ants there, and there's one of them crawling about on a bit of lichen. So that is one of our rarest. You're not going to find that in the northwest. If you found it anywhere other than there and there, you'd be a myrmicological hero. A lot of money's been spent trying to conserve that fellow. Much more common, but still not a common species. And again, with this rather strange split distribution, part in the Highlands, part in the South, is the very, very interesting blood red slave making ant, Formica sanguinea. It's redder than the others, probably. The other wood ant type ones. It's not a true wood ant, it's different subgenus again. The most characteristic feature is the top lip, or clipeus, in Formica sanguinea has a notch in it. So in the other wood ant-like species, that's continuous, but in sanguinea, it's got this notch. And as its name suggests, this is a slave-making ant. It raids the nests of generally the Formica fusca, Formica lamani type ants, will carry off pupae and so on. There's a lovely account of a raid in another book I failed to get down to show you. This one, which you can buy, obviously massively out of date, but still a fascinating read. This book, can I get it on there? Which is Donisthorpe's British Ants, published in, I think, 1927. And there's some lovely accounts in there, which are still well worth reading. The names are out of date, the keys are out of date and so on, but it's still a book worth having. And if you want to read about a Formica sanguinea raid, there's a lovely account in there. Temnothorax interruptus is another species of great concern. There's a nice report you can read online of conservation efforts for this in the New Forest. It does seem to be found at Dungeness. I've not seen it there, I haven't spent that much time there. But this is one of the ones that was Leptothorax. It's much tinier than the Leptothorax acavorum, the spined ant. I've shown you albipennis already. This is an incredibly rare one. This was discovered by the sadly late Graham Elmes, and I think he was in the middle of discovering this when I was talking to him back in the 70s when I went down there. You can see why it's got its name, the hairy Myrmica. It's as far as I know, an obligate parasite of other Myrmicas, and it's only been found in about half a dozen sites. So another one, worth keeping an eye out, but be very tricky to find. This one I'll skip over. Myrmica schenki is an interesting one. This is one I was talking about earlier. This has been baited with some of Mike Fox's pink cake crumbs and has come to them. But it has this interesting nest. I don't know whether any others do this, but as far as I know, not in this country. And it builds these little grass turrets over its nest, which are then guarded by a worker. So again, it stretches up into the north, but over on the east. But if you're over in those areas, well worth looking out for. It tends to nest in sort of open, grassy areas. Myrmica specioides, another rare Myrmica, only found around the East Anglian coast and around the Kent coast. Again, worth looking out for if you're down that way. It probably is coastal in distribution, so you probably wouldn't expect it to find it in here. But on the other hand, there it is further inland, although you're going up the Thames estuary. Solenopsis fugax, again, very, very uncommon, a Channel Island species, but also found in a few sites along the Bristol Channel, Isle of Wight, around the Thames. Again, worth looking out for if you're down that way. And then Strongylognathes, which is again a parasite. The thing I've picked out here are these odd, untoothed, sickle-shaped jaws. I've not managed to find this although I know Andy has seen it down in Dorset. Formica caniculare we've dealt with. So really that's the end of me. I just ought to thank everybody. And as I say at the bottom, I'm sure there are many others, but I was got onto doing this by Tony Hunter at Liverpool Museum when I was over there doing all the pictures you saw in my first slide. So thanks to him for the loans and the equipment, and Dimitri at Manchester, Andy I've mentioned lots of times, obviously Gary and Leanna who've helped in organising all this, BWARS for their endless help in all of this and their huge kindness in allowing me to use their maps, Keith Henry, with whom I spent a wonderful day in South Wales finding and photographing the black bog ant, Ian Beavis I've mentioned, who helped me by email to find Rufibarbis in the Scilly Isles, and Ross Johnson and his son helping to find Sanguinea, and Elva Robinson, who's been endless help, but particularly finding shining guest ants. So that is me, though that slide we saw earlier. Oh, I just ought to mention, yeah, I think I forgot to put in a link. This is the draft quick key, which hopefully will be helpful to make a start when you're getting into ants, if and when you get into ants. This will be in the book. Obviously, it'll be along with Andy's excellent and up-to-date detailed keys, and it's just to workers, but it takes you through what we've really talked about this evening. So 1 segment to the waist, 2 segments to the waist. I don't deal with the dolichoderines or the ponerines in this. Tiny shining ant, Formica nitidulus, 2 segments with independent colonies, then it's either square-shouldered and black, in which case it's tetrama, and so on. So you might find that sort of quick check key, I think in the first edition, we called it a guessing guide, useful to get yourself started. And that's the end.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Gary. That was an absolutely fascinating introduction. And I'm sure many people are looking forward to the new book coming out next year.
Not leave me.
Yeah, and you know, you've done very well to manage to get all high resolution photos of every species. That's very impressive.
The editing that's bothered me more than the pictures, and we'll see how it goes anyway. We've got to see whether the publishers are happy or not. It's not easy to get rid of the background on a photograph of an ant, which has lots of hairs and things sticking out from it. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, there was a lot about hairs in identifying by the sounds of things. I appreciate
those
that.
pictures in the book won't be there to aid with identification. They'll just be there as a sort of a habitus picture, and then if for the identification, if you need to look for hairs here or not hairs there and so on, it will be a question of mainly Andy's wonderful drawings, which I think are still by far the best way to look at these things.
Great, and I was very impressed by the distribution maps. Actually, I hadn't appreciated, I suppose, how well recorded ants had been in terms of I don't think I've sort of met someone who's really focused on ants and collects lots of ants and records them. Maybe I'm a bit ignorant, and I know there's a few people in the Northwest who are, who are doing it, but it's not necessarily their main thing.
I think there are a good lot of people around the country that do. I'm not one, by the way. I don't take any credit for that. I've submitted about 4 records. It's not so much my thing. I'm more sort of interested in the ecology and the behaviour and so on. But there are a lot of people around, I think, doing it. But the map I didn't show, which maybe on hindsight I should have shown, is the one that shows every square where there have been records of ants, and of course, as always, it tails off as you move further north. But no, there's a lot of effort gone in. I think many thanks now to Mike Fox, who I think is online this evening, who collates all of that now, and I think Andy Jarman, who used to do that job before he moved up to be a prof in Edinburgh. So yeah, we have a pretty good picture, but it's never complete, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it always makes a difference when new books come out, of course. I think, well, my impression, I suppose, is I'd always thought they had a reputation as a bit of a challenging group, and so I've never even attempted to identify one before, but I probably should. The only thing I've ever done is looked for the scarce 7-spot ladybird around.
Oh yeah.
Try and messed around trying to. I've never seen one still, but
Oh, I saw that on Guernsey.
yeah, yeah. We wonder whether that could be in North Lancashire, but there we go.
Now, of course, this is the other thing with the ants. Once you finish with the ants, you've then got dozens and hundreds of Myrmica files. So no, once you start spending time sitting by a nest, if you get bored with the ants, there's probably about 3 dozen rove beetles and little white wood lice and all sorts of other stuff in the nest. So it's a bottomless pit of just endless fascination, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so going into questions, before I wanted to say the first question, I just noticed there was a comment early on related to some of your later slides there, Gary, from John Walters saying Formica rufa is increasing in numbers and range in South Devon and threatening the last population of Formica exolita. Is that the reason why it's threatened then? What are the drivers of the risk of extinction around?
Yeah, I think that is a threat, but I think it's probably the usual habitat loss. And I mean, Pratensis went, as far as I understand it, due to housing developments and just not being looked after, and habitat was lost and the thing went. I mean, obviously, if rufa is threatening it, that is a problem. So that'll be competition, I guess. I mean, rufa just tend to prefer sort of quite sunny sites on sort of woodland edge and so on, woodland clearing. So I suppose it is possible that it can be. I don't know whether anyone else knows more about this. I don't know whether Mike's still online, Mike Fox, whether that's something he's come across, this spread of rufa in Devon.
Yeah, great. And this is quite an informal chat, really. So if you have something that you can add, please do just unmute yourself and feel free to comment. Yeah.
I'm just looking down all the chat comments. I think I see Andy's been thank you, Andy, answering a lot of the questions that.
Yes. Yeah.
The Pratensis loss. Yeah, competition from F rufa. So there may well be a threat to Exector in Devon if rufa is doing well. I mean, I think rufa is doing all right in the south, but I don't know. I can just go back to my slide and just see if I can remind myself what Elva said in her report. She said of it in the north, rufa is struggling at the northern end of its range, whilst Lugubrious is doing well at the southern end of its range. And interestingly, she thought that was at odds with climate change driven patterns of species shifting as the conditions become more clement. So she thought it might be more about local weather patterns, habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. I mean, it's one of the things that troubles me. There's a bit of a tendency to sort of blame climate change for everything. That seems to be a case where, you know, it's not easily linked to climate change, but it's linked to the more well-known just general habitat loss, mismanagement, and so on. I mean, I was devastated to go to the woodland where I spent 3 years almost continuously of my life doing work on Formica rufa, to find that the whole shooting match has disappeared completely, and I'm not sure why. And that pheasants may have a role. I don't know enough about that aspect of it. There weren't pheasants around when I was there. There was a lot of evidence of pheasants when I went back a year or so ago. And I know they eat wood ant pupae, but whether they are likely to cause on their own the extinction of a whole set of nests, I don't know. I don't know if anybody else would be able to elaborate on that. I'm just trying to go down all these questions. So so Andy used National Museum of Scotland.
So Ben Hargreaves will ask, well, answered it really already about Formica rufa seems to have declined in certain areas of North
Yeah.
Lancashire, South Cumbria, but have any other areas of the UK within the range of Formica rufa seen significant declines? But you think they're doing better in the south. Is there a reason why they might be increasing in the south?
Not that I'm aware of, but I mean, that might be a climate change thing. I'm not sure. It's certainly, it's weird. I mean, it certainly still seems to be, although it's gone from parts of that northwest, it still seems to be doing perfectly fine in places like Arnside Knot and around the sort of Grange area, where I did work on them there back in the 70s. And unlike the ones that I did my main work, they're still there. But the other ones have gone. I suspect a lot of it is to do with what people do, really, to be honest. Why there would be a, oh, excuse me, why there would be a north-south divide in relation to that's more difficult to say. But certainly Elva felt that the rufa was doing okay in the south, but not doing very well at the north end of its range. But it is doing okay in some parts of Cumbria. I found the colonies on gate barrows very strange. I just suppose it's just because of the substrate, but they're not mound nests. They're kind of down in grikes, and but they're doing the normal stuff and foraging up and down trees and tending aphids and so on. It's a very odd setup there. I don't know whether Ben knows that area.
Yeah, Ben, I'm sure Ben does. I wanted to ask about, so in terms of species being introduced to this country, because you see often, you know, in potted plants, you see there's ants, you know, these colonies often living in the soil of the pots. But I'm not sure if I missed it, but I don't think you mentioned any particularly that have become naturalized in the UK.
I didn't. I avoided that whole area. I mean, obviously, you've got various things. You've got Pharaoh's ant, which is well known, but I mean, I don't think it's much found outside, but it's found in hospitals and that sort of place. Another example, which struck me, I went to the Eden Project, and in the what do you call them? Those things? They're kind of like greenhouses, aren't they? In those things, there's just white-footed ants, Technomyrmex, I think it is, just all over the place. And there's dozens of things. There's a nice paper you can get online, which is quite old, it's 30s, but literally dozens of species been found at Kew Gardens, which obviously is related to exotic plants coming in. Now, in terms of finding of stuff establishing itself outside, there are records of things found in sort of like compost heaps where it's a bit warmer and that sort of thing. I think particularly Matt Hamer is very interested in all of that. So if anybody's interested further in that, they might contact him. I think he actually works out in Hong Kong, but he's always been very willing to chat to me about it. They're along with Andy Marquis, they're describing 2 or 3 new ones that they found on Guernsey. There's I did have in the. Am I still sharing my screen? Probably not.
No, you're not. No. Feel free to.
Yeah. I'll just go. I mean, it's just a name, but I skipped over the slide on the Ponerines because I was conscious then that I was going to be. So these two, these are in terms of all the species we talked about, these are quite primitive, and you can see they're sort of more wasp-like than some of the ants that we've been looking at this evening. They are our 2 truly native species, and they both, for example, apparently can be seen at Dungeness. But then there's a couple of introduced ones whose names are up on the right there, and they're found in greenhouses and hothouses. And I think, again, I don't know whether Mike's gone or what, but I was unable to check some of this stuff because sadly the site being down. But I think 1 or 2 places have got colonies of them living apparently outside. Another one that I was conscious that I could have talked about, but I didn't, but since we're having questions, is Lasius neglectus, which I think somebody's tried to call it the invasive garden ant. And that one really has established itself. It's come from over the east somewhere, Eastern Europe, sort of Western Russia kind of area, I think. And I went to look at a colony in a little village called Kirksmeaton, which has been a PhD under Elva Robinson's guidance done on the species there. And I was scoping around looking for it, and I ended up on an allotment and got talking to a man, and he said, oh yeah, everybody's got them in the houses and they're all over the place. And that could be a problem. In terms of its distribution, there's quite a lot on the Bee Wars website about this invasive garden ant, Lasius neglectus. Just seeing if I've got, yeah, that's not very good. Sorry, I was just seeing if I had a picture I could quickly share. None of them are great.
So how do you address the issue of whether in terms of what to put into the book, whether something is sort of found in the wild in the UK or
good question. I mean, we're fixed on what we're fixed on now. There's the invasive garden ant. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So that's quite an interesting one. In quite a lot of the Philip Buchan Bonnet is the guy that's done the PhD. I don't know who Paul Lee is. I should probably. And Elva's the person at York who supervised that. It's still very like black garden ant, but behaviourally it's very different. If it swarms up trunks of trees and so on. And as I say, these people in Kirksmeaton were, or at least this one gardener I was talking to, he said, oh yeah, they're everywhere. Go and look under that plant pot over there. And there were thousands of them. Back to the question of how we decide on that. This again is very much thanks to the Bees, Wasps and Ants people, because I've taken, and I think Andy's had his say, and if he thinks anything's missing, I'm sure he'll tell me. But we've kind of come to a joint list, which was kind of worked out in terms of what Bee Wars lists on their website. So, for example, I think, again, I've just not been able to double check these facts, but I think Strumigenis perplexa has ended up on the Bee Wars website as being now a British species, whereas Technomyrmex, whatever it is, the white-footed ant that's in the Eden Project, isn't. And I think Mike would say and concur that it's a little bit of a matter of opinion. The problem with a book, of course, in comparison with, say, a website, is that once a few thousand being churned off the press, hopefully in the first half of next year, then whatever it says is fixed. The one that I'm replacing is now 20, I can't believe it, but 25 years ago that was published, and there's masses of stuff in it that's wrong. So we've decided on the list we've decided on, and hopefully it will be in line with what the consensus is, which I take as the Bees, Wasps and Ants website. What do they have on there is the consensus of species that can be regarded as British. There will be a little section in the book on, I don't know what you want to call them, tramp species, exotic species, introduced species, whatever. There'll be a little bit in there, but there's many that might be found in a greenhouse or hothouse or warehouse or something that's not been seen before. Just like giant spiders.
Okay, thanks, Gary.
Okay, no worries.
So if you just sort of unshare your screen, and I can.
Yeah, sorry, I'm clicking on Zoom and it's not wanting me to. Oh, hang on. Here we go. Right, got it. Stop share. There we go.
Oh yeah, just so I can see if anyone has got their hand up. Would anyone like who would? Oh, there we go. Steve Tapman has. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, Steve?
Yes, thank you, Gary. That was really interesting. I'm by no means an expert. I've been lucky enough to do some trips with Mike this year.
Okay.
I have found that as you say, as in some of the regional guides, some regional literature is quite tricky to find. I had a family holiday to the Lake District this year and took the 56 paper with me. But I also found there's an FSC plugin for GIS software, and you can kind of drop the bee wars data into it.
Okay.
And generate your own kind of. I clipped it to the sort of national park boundary, and generated my own kind of field guide maps, which is quite useful. And you know, if anyone is interested in doing that for an area, I'd be very happy to repeat the process. But I was just wondering about the those wood ant nests you showed, the very tall one near Loch Ness, and then much smaller down in Guernsey. And I wonder whether there was any kind of thermal thing with a very big nest being better for colder conditions and warmer conditions, not needing that kind of massive nest. Is that a factor?
Well, it might be. I mean, one of the alternative names always used to be for those things that they build was a solarium, and another thing that sort of links up with that is that something I didn't show is this fascinating thing that happens usually on one of the first nice days of the spring, maybe in mid-February, when a shaft of sunlight hits a wood ant's nest, and as a research student working on a thing that basically went underground and did nothing for 6 months, it was always a very exciting moment. Well, always 3 times a very exciting moment for me when I first started to see ants moving about and doing stuff, and they'd come out onto the surface in what people refer to as a spring mass, and thousands of them just sitting on the surface. And one of the ideas is that the bodies are warming up, and then they take that warmth back inside. So there's a huge requirement for the temperature to be right. They move their brood up and down, apparently, in relation to temperature. So the brood, the larvae, and the pupae will be taken into the nest to the place that's the right temperature, which might be deeper down at certain points and higher up at other points. But no, it's an interesting suggestion that I've not looked into. You do get big nests down south. There's some massive wood ants nests, Formica rufa nest, for example, in Blean Woods in Kent, which I've been to a few times now because my daughter lives very near there. And there's some huge nests there. Although Pratensis was there when I was down at Fursbrook in the 70s, I didn't go and see it. So I don't know whether anybody that's online saw Pratensis nests on the mainland, and whether their tiny size on Guernsey is, I mean, this could be a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, but due to the rather cramped habitat that they're in, they're on these cliff top paths with nothing much. If you're walking along it one way, nothing much to the left, because it just falls down into the cliff, into the face of the cliff, and then on the right you've got a bit of habitat, and then you're into agricultural fields. So there kind of wasn't much space for a big nest. Whether there are large nests of Pratensis outside of that rather odd habitat, I can't answer that. Probably Seafoot would tell you, but there might be somebody that's online now that's seen Pratensis in other places, like on the mainland of the UK back in the 80s and before it went extinct, or on the continent. So it's an interesting suggestion. I don't so much see the correlation. Those pictures, obviously, big tall nest for Aquilonia up in Scotland, and little tiny, not very tall nest for Pratensis down on Guernsey, would suggest big tall nests, cold places, little nests, warm places. But as I say, you do get massive nests of roofer way down south. So I'm not sure whether it's something worth looking at. I did quite a lot of work when I was working on roofer, you know, in the days long before anything like the sort of data logging equipment that we have now. I did quite a lot of work on nest temperatures and environmental temperatures and soil temperatures and so on. And there really is quite a lot to be done on, or there's quite a lot of interesting things in relation to temperature inside an ant's nest. There's an old wives thing that well, if you which I did on one or two occasions, often just to impress people, but if you go up to a big wood ant's nest, so you don't do too much damage, and just push your arm into it, it's really warm inside. And the old wives' tale is it's a good cure for arthritis, but whether that's the case, I didn't have arthritis in those days. I do now, so maybe I ought to go back and thrust my arm into an ant's nest to find out if it works. But yeah, interesting thought. I see we've got Camponotus, which I think Mike's answered. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Yes. Was Camponotus a native thing then?
No, I mean, Camponotus ants are, I think, quite common on the continent. And I think there have been things that have been Camponotus around and about here, but in this country, but I don't think it's ever sort of established itself. Mike says there's no recent records of it.
Okay. Okay. Andy Young's iPad.
Must sort out changing the name on that. Hi, Gary. I just wanted to check about Lasius ferruginosus. We have quite a few nests locally, which I'd spend quite a bit of time peering at and watching.
Yeah.
And this year seems to have been a little bit different in that I was just wondering whether the excessive heat earlier in the year would have potentially had any effect on like the aphids and then the ants. Because I noticed that, you know, whereas in mid-August it was streaming really, it was like Piccadilly Circus as usual along the streams of ants. But when we were getting into September, when I was going back to check, there were sort of very few ants about on any of the nests I was looking at. I wasn't sure whether that was normal by that time. I thought they wouldn't have gone down to such low numbers, but I did wonder whether they were sort of more likely to be travelling under, because I believe they travel underground as well.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. So you think they may have been avoiding the hot temperatures by going underground more than they would?
I was wondering, they just seem to have disappeared now. Or numbers of, obviously now they've dropped off a lot more, but there were just very few. Yeah. Because we'd also had.
Yeah, I've never done long-term observations of that ant. I mean, it's just one I love to watch for half an hour when I find it. We've never had them in areas that I've lived in. So whereabouts are you?
In the West Midlands near Pershore.
Right. Yeah.
And there's sort of quite a good population.
In comparison to Septembers of previous years, do you think they were less active?
Yes, I think it does seem to be so, because I just went to keep checking on, and I checked all the different ones, because when I found there weren't that many at one, I thought, well, let's see whether they're just less active elsewhere, and they were all the same. And it's been a bit different because they've been interacting with the Stomaphis graphi aphids as well, the giant maple aphids, and I haven't seen so much activity of that this year either. And I think again that might be, I just wondered whether they're doing it sort of underground, because they do seem to have created little shelters of soil and debris at the base of the tree.
Yeah, no, I can't really add to that. I mean, it sounds as if it's something that's worth keeping an eye on. It could be a climate change thing. I mean, I know that that species is fairly well known to be a bit mobile. You know, and you'll have it in one place for a while, and then they'll go and move somewhere else. And because of the rather unusual life cycle they've got, where they're a temporary parasite of a temporary parasite, it's a bit precarious for them. But I think it's possibly our loveliest ant. I think it's just a beautiful thing. I think you've frozen, sorry.
Yes, it's a delightful to watch, and I found another tree, so that's if it has moved, at least I found somewhere else.
Have you ever seen the carton nests in situ?
Yes, luckily we had a tree that fell down and it exposed nests, so I got to see inside, which was amazing to see the structure.
Yeah. When I was zooming up and down the country as much as I could in the middle of COVID lockdown, trying to get all the photographs for this book, it was one of the things I could never. I mean, I've seen them before. I used to have them in the grounds of the school where I worked, but I couldn't find a decent bit of carton to photograph. So I've had to go to someone who's kindly granted me permission to use their picture. So.
Well, I think that one was probably better. I have got some pictures. That had on the one you had on your slide was probably better, I think. But I can send you some anyway. That's
from a paper you can get online.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing those. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming and your questions and so on, and maybe we'll see all sorts of new ants being discovered in the northwest. I mean, not new ants as such, but new to the northwest. I'm sure they're under-recorded, despite the fact, as you say, the BWAS maps are brilliant and Mike does a fantastic job. But I still think there's probably lots of play. I mean, you look at the in Ben and Steve, that's it, yeah, book. Something like Lasius flavus, which is just kind of everywhere, or Lasius niger. There's lots of squares in Lancashire and Merseyside where they're not recorded. So that must mean that nobody's looked. So everybody go out and have a look.
Yeah, please do.
Right, fantastic. Right, well, I look forward to being over in Liverpool next Friday, and I see a few people have said they're looking forward to the workshop. So I look forward to seeing all of you that are coming to that, and I'll try and make it different.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.